I admit.
Defendant Jake Haro pleading guilty, admitting to murdering his son, baby Emmanuel. But the 7-month-old's remains still not found.
We're outside the Haro family home, and you can see right behind me there's a small memorial for baby Emmanuel. Today, his father admitted to killing him. We spoke with a man who was inside the courtroom and witnessed the guilty plea.
So where is he, and will we ever find out? Plus, a Family Matters star in court acting like an attorney. We'll show you the video that is swirling around online.
A courtroom shuddered with an unexpected confession, and a community that had spent weeks searching, pleading, and praying was left stunned. Today, a man identified as Jake Haro pleaded guilty to the murder of 7-month-old Emmanuel Haro, admitting in court not only to the killing but also to related counts of child endangerment and making a false police report. The plea was sudden, and it answered a question that had hung over the case: who would take responsibility for what happened to the baby? Yet it left other questions raw and unresolved, and it made the coming weeks feel like the hinge point between grief and whatever measure of justice can follow. If you want to stay up to date on verified developments as this case moves through the courts, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Cases like these change quickly, and confirmed facts, not rumor, are what will bring the public closer to closure. What happened in court was not just legal procedure, it was an emotional shock. Witnesses in the gallery described visible tears and a kind of stunned silence when the plea was entered. For volunteers who had spent nights walking neighborhoods, scanning trash heaps, and calling out a child's name, the moment was inexplicably powerful, an admission of guilt from a man at the center of a case that had consumed local attention. Courts often confront grief and law together, but a guilty plea in a murder case shifts the investigative focus from proving involvement to dealing with the consequences, sentencing, corroborating details, and, crucially, continuing efforts to find the child's remains. The plea agreement covers a package of charges: the homicide itself, allegations that the child was endangered while alive, and the filing of a false police report that initially framed the disappearance. Those charges map the story investigators have been building, that initial public statements did not align with evidence collected later, and that the conduct under review involved not only an act of extreme violence but also an attempt, according to prosecutors, to obscure what had happened. From a legal perspective, a guilty plea removes the need for a prolonged trial to prove those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant has admitted them. From a human perspective, a confession does not automatically provide the answers people most want. Where is Emmanuel, and how did his short life end? Outside the courthouse, volunteers who had mobilized across Southern California described the guilty plea the way you'd expect people to describe a sudden weather change: bright light followed by a new chill. These volunteers had responded to televised appeals by the child's parents and to widespread social media posts that turned the small city where Emmanuel was last seen into a focal point for a region to rally. Search parties combed fields, inspected dumpsters, and worked alongside K-9 teams and law enforcement in hopes of turning up some physical trace. When the plea came, those community searchers felt a complicated mix of vindication, frustration, and sorrow. Vindication because action had finally been taken that acknowledged criminal responsibility. Frustration because the plea didn't, by itself, reveal the final location of the child. Sorrow because the most important question, the child's whereabouts, remained unresolved. Legal analysts and at least one outside attorney suggested a possible explanation for the sudden plea. In many criminal investigations, a defendant will plead guilty if new evidence surfaces, if interrogation yields incriminating statements, or if a deal is reached in exchange for cooperation on related questions. The attorney argued publicly that the plea could indicate that Haro faced incriminating evidence strong enough that continued denial would be futile, or that he chose to plead in return for certain concessions, perhaps the promise of a specific sentencing recommendation or information protection agreements. Those are common mechanisms in criminal practice. Pleas are bargains that allow prosecutors to secure convictions and defendants to potentially avoid the uncertainty of a trial. Whatever the legal calculus, the courtroom admission had concrete consequences. It set a sentencing date and shifted the public narrative. Rebecca Haro, Emmanuel's mother, continues to maintain her innocence and has formally entered a not guilty plea. Her position ensures that the legal process will continue in earnest. not only in the sentencing of the man who pleaded guilty, but in the adjudication of the charges that remain in play. A not guilty plea is, by design, a starting point for a defense. It forces prosecutors to produce evidence, to disclose the forensic and testimonial basis for their case, and to meet the high legal standard required for conviction. Rebecca's plea guarantees further hearings, discovery motions, and the exchange of proof that will ultimately determine whether she faces conviction, acquittal, or some negotiated resolution. For the community and for investigators, her continued denial means that the story is not yet complete. The courtroom will still be the venue where much of the truth, or what the law accepts as truth, is argued and tested. Despite the guilty plea, investigators have said the search for Emmanuel's remains active. That underlines a difficult reality in cases like this. A confession, even an admission of murder, does not automatically produce physical closure. Authorities need remains for several reasons. From a prosecutorial standpoint, physical evidence can corroborate statements about time, cause, and manner of death, and it can strengthen the case against co-defendants if there are any. For families and communities, the recovery of a loved one is essential to grief and to ritual: a grave to visit, a body to bury, the verification that a child's life ended in a particular place and a particular way. Law enforcement teams continue to search fields, drainage areas, landfills, and other sites where tips, geolocation data, or canine alerts have suggested potential leads. That work is painstaking, often dangerous, and always time-consuming. It is, however, also the work that can turn a legal confession into a fuller factual picture. A sentencing date for the man who pleaded guilty has been set for November 3rd, and that date now carries outsized significance. Sentencing is the moment the court officially imposes a punishment for the admitted crimes. It is a time when victims' families and community members often speak, and when the legal system formally registers the consequences of wrongdoing. The range of penalties depends on the charges and the plea agreement terms, but in a murder case the sentence is likely to be substantial. Even so, a sentence without the recovery of remains or a complete reconstruction of events may feel incomplete to those who have lost a child and to neighbors seeking full answers. November 3rd is also the date scheduled for a preliminary hearing in the case against Rebecca. That coincidence is telling. On the same day the court will address punishment for an admitted offender, it will also review whether there is sufficient cause to proceed with charges against a person who has pled not guilty. Preliminary hearings are legal checkpoints. Judges review probable cause, hear contested evidence in a limited way, and decide whether the prosecution's case is strong enough to bind the defendant over for trial. For Rebecca, that hearing will be a critical test. But for the family and the community, it is yet another high-stakes legal moment that could either accelerate a trial timetable or delay final resolution depending on the judge's ruling and the available evidence. Community memorials have proliferated in recent weeks, a testament to how deeply this case has touched people in the region. People lay flowers, light candles, and leave stuffed animals and handwritten notes at places tied to Emmanuel's life and disappearance. Vigils were organized within days of his reported disappearance and multiplied as the case unfolded, providing a forum for collective mourning and a visible reminder that, beyond legal procedures and investigative tactics, a small life was taken. The public grief has been accompanied by organizing. Volunteer groups coordinate searches, share resources for families, and push for transparency where possible. That mobilization transformed what might have been a local missing person case into a regional story of communal grief and collective responsibility. There are practical takeaways from this painful sequence. An early guilty plea answers one of the central questions for the public, who admitted responsibility, but it does not, by itself, resolve the broader investigative gaps that remain. The mother's continued not guilty plea ensures that the court will still hear conflicting narratives and demands that the prosecution substantiate every claim with evidence. The search for Emmanuel's remains is essential not only emotionally but legally. Without physical recovery, certain forensic questions may remain unresolved. The public's engagement turned this into more than an isolated tragedy. It became a mobilizing event that showed how communities can act quickly and compassionately in the face of loss. And perhaps most immediately, November 3rd now looms as a decisive day. It will shape sentencing for the defendant who pleaded guilty and determine whether charges against Rebecca will proceed to trial. For families and neighbors, the days between now and November 3rd will be filled with waiting. That waiting is not passive. Investigators will continue to follow leads, forensic teams will analyze materials already recovered, and prosecutors will prepare the evidence they intend to use in court. Defense teams for the accused will mount their responses, pursuing discovery and challenging procedural points. Community groups will maintain vigils and continue to urge law enforcement to be thorough in search efforts. The emotional tenor of the region will remain heavy, even as legal procedures churn forward. A guilty plea in a murder case brings with it complicated emotions. On one hand, it can bring a measure of immediate accountability, an admission that something horrific occurred and that someone will be punished. On the other hand, it can also feel incomplete if the most intimate answers, where a child's body rests, how exactly he died, are not publicly revealed. In this case, the juxtaposition of a guilty plea and an active search underscores that legal facts and human closure do not always arrive together. As the community waits, the broader lessons of this story will also press for attention. The way the case unfolded, a missing infant, a region-wide search, mounting suspicion, a dramatic courtroom plea, raises questions about investigative best practices, about the speed and transparency of public communications, and about the resources available to families and to law enforcement in the toughest hours. Those are debates for policymakers and practitioners, but they are also lived realities for the people whose lives are most affected. For now, the simplest facts are these. A father has pleaded guilty to murdering his 7-month-old son. The mother maintains her innocence and faces continued legal proceedings. The child's remains have not been located, and a court date on November 3rd will be decisive for sentencing and for the future of the outstanding charges. That date will determine a legal trajectory, but it will not, by itself, erase the grief the community carries. When a case like this moves through the justice system, it does so under the glare of public feeling and the strictures of legal proof. The next weeks will test both. The courts must ensure that any convictions are grounded in admissible evidence and fair procedures. The community must continue to give verified information to investigators and to support the family in ways that do not interfere with the search or the legal process. If you have relevant information, provide it to law enforcement through formal channels so that it can be documented and used where it counts. At the end of the day, the guilty plea is a major step in a long, painful process. It brings some answers but leaves other, crucial pieces still to be found. Emmanuel's name has been spoken in fields and courtrooms and vigils across Southern California. The hope now is that, between ongoing searches, court scrutiny and community resolve, the missing answers will be recovered before November 3rd, and that the day's decisions will move the region closer to a hard-earned sense of justice and closure.